Hi everyone. The lesson is classes and object, part 6, working with objects in Objective-C. The tools we will be using are listed below with the developer docs referencing. Prerequisite, you have to make sure you look at the previous lesson, class and objects part 5. You can find the link for that lesson in the description. In this session, we'll be discussing things such as objects can send and receive messages, to a certain extent by now. Passing objects for parameters. Objects can send message to themselves using the keyword self. Objects can call methods in the superclass using super keyword. Objects are created dynamically, you know a bit of that. And class factory methods are alternative to allocation initialization. We will talk about that. Then you can use the new to create an object, right? If no arguments are needed for initialization, right? What does that mean? So it means you can use the keyword new to create objects instead of using alloc and init separately. We will look at it. Then determining equality of objects. So the difference between the equal operator versus is equals method and working with nil. As usual, we will be focusing on practical demo lessons, right? So let's look into the section in the developer doc. So working with objects. So first part, objects can send and receive message. Now, once you create an object, you can call a method on that. We have done the practical for that in a previous lesson, right? So for example, if you got XYZ person class, right, and this method say hello, right? And then once you create object of XYZ person, let's say if you create some person, then you can call the say hello method. Awesome, right? Let's scroll down. Then you can pass objects for parameters, right? So always for a method, you can pass an object as a parameter. Now, NSString is a class, so greetings is an object. So this is an example showing you that you can pass objects as parameters, and we'll be doing that in more detail practically in future lessons. Then very important, objects can send messages to themselves, meaning object can call a method of itself, right? Say, for example, if there's a class, if there's a method called say hello, also if there's another method called say hello method can call the say something method. In that case, when the say hello method want to call the say something method, the say something method is in the same class. So if the object want to send a message to themselves, meaning because the you say hello method want to call say something, so it need to send a message to themselves. In other words, you use the keyword self. So when the say hello method want to call the say something method in the same class, you will say self say something. So that means you are sending a message to itself, right? We'll be using this a lot when we do practical lessons in future classes, in future lessons. Then objects also can call methods implemented in the superclass, that means in the parent class. So for example, if you got a parent class called XYZ person, and then if you get a child class, we are discussing more about inheritance in future, right? But for now, just get an idea. So the XYZ shouting person is a child of XYZ person. So when you implement the XYZ person is this class over here, right? So this one. Now the child class is XYZ shouting person. So when you implement the child class, let's say if the child class has a method called say something, right? Let's say you get a parameter, right? Let's say and say that you convert it to upper string and it prints it, right? Greetings uppercase string, right? Let's go down to see where it used the super. See, something like this now. So the XYZ shouting person can call the parent class say something method. Now XYZ shouting person is a child class. So the child class also has a method say something. But XYZ shouting person is a child of XYZ person. So the XYZ person class also has a method called say something. So if you want to call a method of the parent class, you can always say super and pass the message. It can be any other method even, or it can be similar method. So that is how you call, you talk to the parent class, right? So that comes under the topic objects can call methods implemented by their superclass. Very important. And we'll be doing all the practicals in future lessons, and we'll be using this knowledge for future lessons. Then objects are created dynamically. As you know, you will alloc and init. We have been doing this practical now, right? So we are used to allocating and then calling the init at the same time, right? So here you allocate memory for the object, and here you initialize and then you store it in the pointer. That is what we have been doing. It says never initialize an object without reassigning any pointer to that object. So for example, don't do this. Now even you can alloc separately and init separately. If you don't assign the initialized result into the object, you will not get the initialized result. So don't do something like that. That is why we just combine it and do. But if you're doing it like this, you have to make sure after init, you have to again assign it to the pointer. Also, initializers can take parameters, arguments. We'll be talking about that when we declare init methods. We will show you how to do it further. Then also there can be class factory methods as an alternative to allocate init. So normally to create objects, you will alloc and init. But also in the programming world, there are certain methods called factory methods. So class factory methods, meaning this plus is a class method. We'll talk about that in another lesson in detail. But for you, for now, the idea is you don't have to always alloc and init. If you define factory methods as say class factory methods, you can just call that. For example, in this ns number is a standard class. There's a factory method called number with init, number with int. When you pass it, it returns a ns number object. Now, as you can see, here we are creating ns number object. So usually when you create an object, you have to alloc and init. But as you can see, here we are not alloc and init. Here we are calling a method in the same ns number class itself, and we are passing. So here we are calling the method on the class, not on object. ns number is a class. That is why we call them as class methods. Then why is it a factory method? That is because this method generates and returns a ns number object. That's why we call it as a factory method, so that it's a standard thing in programming, so that this is effectively the same as alloc and init, right? But class factory methods usually just call straight through the for convenience, right? You call it directly through the class, right? Then you can use the keyword new or the method new, right? It's a message, right? The message new. You can use the message new to create objects if no arguments are needed for initialization. So these are small concepts. So which means, let's say if no arguments are needed to initialize, so it's possible to create an instance of a class using the new class method. It's a class method. This method is provided by ns object, so it's in the ns object parent class and doesn't need to be overridden. It's effectively doing alloc and init with no arguments. If you don't need to pass any arguments, you can straight away call whatever the given object new. It's same as that object alloc and init. So alloc and init combine is new, so new method. That's used when you don't want to pass initialization, right? We'll talk about that more in detail, right? And then literals. So literals, so whenever you use string literals, you have to put @ symbol in front. Likewise, and when it comes to literals, let's read. Some classes allow to use more concise literal syntax to create instances. You can create an NSString instance using the special literal notation. So when you put the @ symbol, it creates a object. It creates an instance, right? So that's what it says. Some classes allow you to use literal syntax to create instance. So literal syntax means when you put @ you call it as literal syntax, and that also create an instance. So not all the classes allows it, but classes like ns number allows it, right? And certain ns string, etc. So you call them once again as literal syntax, right? And Objective-C is a dynamic language. We have spoken about that earlier as well. Then when it comes to determining the equality of objects, right? So if you need to determine whether one object is the same as another object, that means equality, it is important to remember that you are working with pointers. So in pointers, when you use double equal, it's testing. Okay, let's look into this. So when you use the equal operator for primitives, it's comparing the value. But when you use the equal operator with pointers, it's not comparing the values of the two pointers. It's comparing the memory locations. It's comparing whether these two are in this referring to the same memory location. So if instead of that, if you need to test whether the two objects has the same data, if you need to check that, if you need to check if two objects having the same data, then you have to call the isEqual method. It's coming from the NS object parent class. So you have to say first person is equal to second person. That way it's comparing the values of it. But if you say first person equal second person, it's comparing the memory locations. So we'll be talking about this in more detail, right? Also, you can work with nil. Nil means null. So when you create a reference, if you don't alloc an init, it's automatically set to nil, right? So what we discussed in this lesson was some important theory. It was a theoretical discussion, but we try to make it practical with some examples, like discussing examples. But what will happen is in future lessons, we will be using all these concepts such as init, new, super, self keyword, right? And a new method, then equal operator versus isEqual method. So we'll be talking about those in more detail in future practical lessons using practical lessons. So now let's look into the summary of the lesson. So we discussed the theory part a bit practically, but we'll be doing the practicals in future lessons in more detail. Conclusion, you learn about this stuff, especially about, let's pick the important points. Let's say the third bullet point, how about using the self keyword to send messages among the class itself. Then next bullet point, using the super keyword to call the methods of superclass. Then using factory methods and using the new class method instead of using alloc and init. Then the literal syntax to create instances, such as it's like a shortcut way of creating instances. Not all the classes will allow this, but some classes like NSString, NSNumber would allow this. Then the difference between equal operator and the isEqual method. So equal operator, if it's primitives, it checks the values. But if you use the equal operator to compare to pointers, it will not compare the values, it will compare the memory location. If you really want to compare the values of two objects, you have to use isEqual method. Then nil, working with nil, nil is empty references or empty. You can, well, we didn't do a lecture practical, so you will not find the link to download, but in future lessons you will find it. So we use Apple Developer Docs for referencing. Have a look at our other videos for practicals about what we discussed here, right? So we are very excited to see you in another lesson. See you in another lesson.